happened at that point in history to bring about that resurgence?
Well, at the very beginning of World War II, there were really two schools of thought competing, both of which had government agencies. One that was set up was called the Office of War Information, which was a civilian organization, although worked closely with the War Department, as it was then called. And it was headed by a man named Elmer Davis, who was a very famous reporter, a journalist. His philosophy was that the agencies should tell the American people exactly what was happening, tell them the truth. If we lost a battle somewhere in Europe or in the Pacific, we should tell the people we lost that battle. If we won a battle, we tell them we won it. But he believed that in the long run, we would do best by reporting the truth. But at the same time, another key organization that developed during World War II was the Office of Strategic Services, the OSS, which was headed by a military man, William Donovan, who was known as Wild Bill Donovan, who believed the same that George Creel had his philosophy from World War I, which was that you should lie to the people whenever it's necessary, whenever you think lying will help maintain morale and win the war. This struggle was taking place, of course, in the context of World War II, and Donovan won, both with President Roosevelt and after with President Truman. His philosophy that disinformation was a powerful, a valuable weapon for a country to have, and that the disadvantages of lying to the American people were outweighed by the advantages of being able to manipulate the media. So when the war was over, the Office of War Information was dissolved, the OSS was transformed into the CIA, and the CIA was now existing in peacetime, mind you. World War II was over, and now the CIA is set up with disinformation as a major part of its work, and in fact, as most of the reports later pointed out, the largest single part of the CIA's operations. Within the government, at least, the acceptability of lying to the public became very widespread and acceptable even in time of peace. There had been people who felt, well, it's one thing when you're at war, but even in time of peace, it became acceptable, and it spread from other agencies, including the FBI, which also began to engage in media manipulation in a very, very large way.
So, in addition to being a wartime strategy, with respect to the security of the nation and the propagation of falsehoods in times of war, this tactic started to be used in peacetime.
Exactly. That was the major difference. Certain things were much more acceptable or expected over the course of history in time of war, and were generally supposed to stop when the war was over. Now, there were people who argued in the late 40s that the Cold War was a war, just like a hot war, and that was the war that was on, and that was why we had to do this. But what really happened is there were not battles being waged between soldiers. There was not a hot war going on anywhere, and yet the infrastructure that had been set up to spread this information, to be able to lie, became institutionalized and became operating at a greater and greater level.
Mr. Chapp, how is it that some individuals like yourself have become more aware of these kinds of practices in our lifetime, while the mass of the population has not?
Well, it's mostly because by coincidence there were a number of factors that came together mostly in the 1970s, leading to major congressional investigations of these activities, leading some newspapers to fund serious, in-depth investigative reports. And in the middle and late 70s, there were a huge series of congressional reports on intelligence activities, a whole section of which was devoted to media activities. And then there were major exposés in the New York Times and the Washington Post. It was sort of the Watergate mentality, I guess, that allowed this to happen. There was a window of a few years when exposing government misconduct, particularly past government misconduct, and as far as the government was concerned, the older the better. But at least there was a window of opportunity where this was acceptable even within the mainstream, the establishment press. It was not frowned upon as much as it might have been at other times, both before and since.
Before we go into some specific instances of this in detail, can you explain to the court that really how does disinformation work, and why is it so successful?
Well, you have to understand first the target of propaganda, of disinformation, the consumer of the false news, so to speak, is in what we're talking about is the American public in general, and sometimes the public overseas. Disinformation is almost always, by definition, about things that the average person has no separate personal knowledge of, otherwise it couldn't really work. I mean, you can't fool the people you're talking about. You can fool the other people who don't know about it. You're not trying to fool the people you're talking about. The simplest example is during the Vietnam War, when there was a massive bombing campaign and the U.S. was bombing Cambodia. President Nixon and Secretary of State Kissinger repeatedly made public statements that we are not dropping bombs in Cambodia. Well, you couldn't fool the Cambodians who looked up and saw the bombs fall in their backyard. They knew you were bombing Cambodia. But the American people, by and large, accepted these statements as truth, and in fact, that was a disinformation campaign that was later admitted. We're talking about things that the public has no separate knowledge of. And it's also reinforced by the fact that the Americans generally tend to believe what their government tells them, to believe that government officials on all levels generally tell the truth. And that, if you have that absence of skepticism, it's a major plus for the disinformationists. And it's very, very unusual around the world, other than in the United States. In most other countries, particularly in Europe, it's much more the opposite. People tend, on average, to be very skeptical of their government. If the Italian government issues a statement, the average Italian on the street will say it's probably a lie, until you can prove to me otherwise that it's not lying. Because governments lie. That's what they sort of expect them to do that, whereas Americans don't expect that. The average American would hear something from the government or hear the news on television and assumes that what they're hearing is the truth unless they're shown otherwise. They assume that almost nothing is ever a conspiracy. In Europe, it's very much the opposite. Anything happens, they tend to think it's a conspiracy unless you show them that it wasn't a conspiracy. I mean, after all, conspiracy just means, more than one person being involved in something. And if you stop and think about it, almost everything significant that happens anywhere involves more than one person. Yet here, there is not a myth really, but there's just an underlying assumption that most things are not conspiracies. And when you have that, it enables a government which has a propaganda program, has a disinformation program, to be relatively successful in having its disinformation accepted. The other reason why it works, even though, as we know, somewhere there are people who know it's not true. Somewhere they know you're lying about something. But another reason it works is that disinformation is very, very effective over time. The longer that you, whoever you are, can control the spin on the story, the more that spin becomes accepted as the absolute truth. And in this country, the government has a great deal of power and influence over that spin.